If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I would have guessed something with the letters I, P, and A. And I would have been wrong. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is here to stay. And Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain W04 Paramount can help brewers get the most out of their water fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, plus it's gluten-free. If you tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Learn more about this novel strain at imperialyeast.com and pick up your W04 Paramount before it's too late. It's commonly said that brewers make wort while yeast make beer, and as any brewer knows, there are various types of yeast available that produce different characteristics. With beer commonly referred to as liquid bread, perhaps it's unsurprising that the yeast strain associated with ales, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is the same that is used in baking. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about using actual baker's yeast to ferment beer is contributor Andy Carter.
Yeah, Marshall, I love beer. That's why we're here. But in general, I love carbohydrates. And so bread making, I've not made a ton of bread myself, handful of times over the years and stuff, sourdough and everything like that. So I think there's a really cool experiment that Brian did, because you think about yeast and we think about all the yeast you can buy at the shop, right? But then, hey, there's a bunch of yeast right at the grocery store. Could that be used for something? And that sounds a little clickbaity, but hey, these strains are not too dissimilar, and I think this is a great experiment and see how that turns out.
Yeah, I am by no means a microbiologist, and as much as I love science in general, there are certain things that have a tendency to just kind of go over my head. I fully understand that there are various types of yeast strains, like you mentioned, Andy, and when used for fermenting beer, they produce different characteristics. Anyone who's ever made a Saison or Weiss beer has firsthand experience with this. Well, the fact regular old baker's yeast is the same Cerevisiae family as ale yeast is quite interesting to me, and we actually performed that experiment to see how they compare. We're going to talk about that later on in this episode. This is going to be a good one. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. The guest for this month, November of 2021, is Dr. Matt Winans, research and development scientist at Imperial Yeast. If the name sounds familiar, that's likely because he was recently interviewed by Cade on episode 6 of the Brew Lab, which, if you haven't already, I highly recommend listening to. They focused primarily on novel hybrid yeast strains. Fascinating stuff. This is going to be a very cool session for all of you yeast nerds out there. If you'd like to be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, November 26, 2021, as this event is scheduled for Saturday the 27th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. I know we talk about it often, but seeing as the holiday season is upon us and many of you will be doing your gift shopping online, we just want to emphasize how incredibly much we appreciate you using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. You might think you're just one person and that the commission we get from you using those links won't have much of an impact, but a bunch of small things do add up, and we use that revenue for important things like web hosting and web security. Plus, it's so easy to do. All you have to do is go to brewlosophy.com/support, click the link to wherever it is you're buying stuff like Amazon, More Beer, Adventures in Home Brewing, and Great Fermentations. Then you go get your things. That's it. You can even bookmark those links so you don't forget to use them in the future, and it has absolutely zero impact on your shopping experience. Again, thanks to those who have already been doing this. It really is a huge help. Finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, that'd be super cool too. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover-compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with very fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy when you're checking out to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Listener Jeff Wythop wrote in with feedback on a few past episodes. Jeff said, as a new listener to the Brewlosophy podcast, I've been cherry-picking older episodes relevant to upcoming brew days. My last batch was a honey porter with 1 pound of honey at flame out and 5 ounces dissolved in water for keg conditioning. The episodes on brewing with honey and conditioning with different sugars helped a ton. Most recently, I listened to the dessert beers and cream ale episodes to get ready for an upcoming brew. I found myself smiling at the end of the dessert beer episode because you mentioned the exact style I'm planning to brew next. Banana pie ale. I'm using an existing recipe from Ballast Point's Homebrew Mart website, so I'm fairly confident it'll turn out all right, barring brewer error. All that to say, thanks for the amazing resource. I appreciate the podcast and information you all provide. Well, we appreciate you as well.
Yes, the banana beers. I've not had many. I've had a couple, and honestly, I don't eat a ton of bananas. That's probably not good for my health. I should probably eat more bananas. But the ones I've had, at least the research I've done into it is, banana chips. They're already dehydrated. A little bit of that, that moisture's out of it, so you get good banana flavor. I'm guessing that's what he's going to use. I'd be curious to know. But yeah, what I've had is, banana flavor is really actually super solid to get, and it's really nice in a darker beer, chocolate bananas. Who can't like that?
Yeah, so I'm not I actually do eat bananas occasionally. We always have a bunch of bananas at my house. My kids love them. And so I'll grab one every once in a while for a snack. I'm not a big fan of banana flavor in beer. It's one of the reasons that I kind of avoid, German Weissbier. But
sure.
I did years ago, before Brulosophy was ever even a thing, we were doing a local club competition where every quarter you brew a beer and then it gets judged, and it's just kind of a competition between club members. One time, one of those beers was kind of like make something up, do something wild and crazy, and it free for all. You can do whatever you want, but it has to be weird, right? So I made. Do you remember those popsicle ice creams that were like it was like chocolate and banana and then chocolate, and they looked like rocket pops, but they were brown and yellow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to emulate that flavor because I actually enjoyed those quite a bit when I was a kid, and so I made this beer called Coca-Nanilla. And what it was a Hefeweizen, so a Weissbier base that I added some either chocolate malt or roasted grain to kind of up the color a bit. And then I hit it with cacao nibs, vanilla, and I fermented it on the warmer side with a Weissbier strain. And
yes,
I'm telling you, that I got more banana out of that beer without actually adding banana. That's isoamyl acetate. That is what banana flavoring is. And so there are ways to get that banana that banana characteristic without actually using bananas. If you're going to use bananas, I'm sure it'll work fine. It's just like any other fruit that you can add to a beer. But I'm telling you, if you just grab a Weissbier strain and you ferment it, we still need to do that experiment if we haven't already. But they say if you ferment it on the warmer end, you're going to favor that isoamyl acetate, whereas if you go cooler, you're going to favor that 4VG, that more spicy phenolic. So that's my tip. Have you ever used a Weissbier at those different temperatures, Andy?
No, I've not done. I've only done a few because I got into Hefeweizens because there's a brewery in Texas called Live Oak. They make an excellent Hefeweizen, and honestly, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but I was in Chicago recently, and Dovetail Brewing makes a Hefeweizen, which I think might beat it. I was very impressed because why I like those beers is that, like you said, you don't want all that banana or you want that clove, but that whole balance, right? Yeah. So there's some type of sweet spot in the fermentation temperature or the wort composition that makes just balance and be perfect. So I like this a lot, and let it be seen that Marshall has done a dessert beer before. He just hasn't talked about it in about 10 years. So
yeah, you're not wrong, Andy. Thanks for the feedback, Jeff. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. There is just something about Kolsch that I think is so special. I say that often. A relatively easy to brew ale that tastes a lot like a lager, crisp and easy to drink. Well, listener Brian I think it's Garrity, recently made one that he said came out a bit drier than intended, but felt it would please the palates of those who enjoy less characterful beers.
1 minute beer review with Justin and Tim.
I got jeans and boots, and it's like I'm riding across the Midwest. There's not a lot of head on this one.
It's a 5-head.
Oh, not a lot of smell. A lot of flavor. This is good.
Yeah.
I don't know what it tastes like, but it's good. There's definitely some fruit in there. Not malty, not hoppy.
No, it's not bitter.
No.
It's a little pepperish.
I believe that's Argentinian black pepper.
Exactly. Oh, I think you nailed it, dude.
I think I nailed it.
It's not bad.
It's not bad. Not at all. It's good.
It kind of hangs around, though.
There's a flavor that kind of washes across the back of your palate that I can't put my thumb on it.
Yeah, it's It's not 100% for me. It's not bad. I've had a lot worse.
It's not juniper-y.
No, not at all. And we all know I don't know what that tastes like.
Apparently you don't. This is a Pilsner of some type. I'm thinking, no, I'm going to go a pale ale. I'm going to change my mind.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you there.
Some type of pale ale, probably from the South, a Southern pale ale. Tastes a little bitter. It's like, I get it, you didn't win. This is good. I tell you what, the more I drink it, the more I like it.
All right.
Yeah, it's complex.
It's not bad. It really isn't. I'm going with a 7.
You know, I'm going to meet you right there in the middle. I'm going to go with a 7 too.
This was without a doubt one of the driest versions of Kolsch that I've ever had. To the point it like washed right off my palate almost immediately after swallowing. There's a lot of beers, you know, you take a sip, you swallow it, and that flavor kind of lingers for a bit, even if just 4 or 5 seconds. This one was not like that. You got the nose, which was, in my opinion, quite bready, smelled very nice. I didn't get any of the fruit or spice that Justin and Tim were talking about, but as soon as you swallowed, it was like you took a drink of water. It was just gone.
Interesting.
Super dry. Yeah. Very good though. It was well made, clean. I would drink a ton of it sitting by the pool because it didn't really bother the palate very much.
You know, it's interesting. We've done experiments with mash temperature and things and not seeing a good signal in terms of, oh, this affects mouthfeel or dryness. So I wonder, or it makes me wonder, is it a water chemistry issue? Is something going on that's making it wash off so quickly, like a pH or a mineral content that made it so dry?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I don't know, right? It's cool to think, or, you know, whenever I see mouthfeel come up, I always wonder, like, what else is going on in the beer?
Yeah. And I that's a good point that I didn't actually comment necessarily on the mouthfeel, but I do think that washing off the palate experience, that phenomenon is a mouthfeel and body thing. It's because the flavor is there. It tasted very good.
Absolutely.
It just had this thinness that made it wasn't, I'm not that, like, I think a lot of people associate that thin mouthfeel thing as a negative thing. It would actually made the beer incredibly drinkable. It was very, very good. But the water chemistry thing, absolutely. The way I view water chemistry and adding salts to your beer is that you are not actually changing those components. What you're doing is changing the way that those components are perceived. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, if you add for example, you add a bunch of gypsum to a IPA, you are going to get a perceptible crispness. It's not that the beer is more crisp, which people will argue that gets like into linguistic philosophy and stuff. But yeah, the other thing is, and this is off in the weeds as well, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately, that I wonder if there's not a shift happening with how much people are brewing nowadays and how the labs, you know, they're constantly repropping up their yeast from a source that they've got ostensibly. Mm-hmm. If those yeasts aren't getting, in the way that we talk about a hot malt, if those yeasts just aren't getting more attenuative, because if you go and you look at the Hop Chronicles, we've basically been using the Chico strain for that for the most part since we started it. If you go and you back and you look, you'll see, oh, you know, the FG on this 90% pale malt, 10% Vienna malt pale ale, that is always mashed at 154 degrees Fahrenheit. FG is about 1011, 1010. And you look today and it's almost always 1008, 1007.
Wow.
Yeah. So what's happening there? It's just something I've been noticing because we're so deep into this brewing thing. I don't know. And I was wondering as I was drinking Brian's Kolsch, what made it dry out? And it could be that he just accidentally mashed a little bit cooler than
sure.
You know, whatever. But it's just something that's been on my mind. So anyways, well, if you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Justin and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We will be right back after this break. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for
compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. There's absolutely no question that brewers a relatively short time ago, just a couple centuries or so, had little control over the type of yeast they were using to ferment their beer and other concoctions for that matter. Our knowledge of yeast is quite new, and it has allowed for the isolation of various strains that perform in very predictable ways these days. Of all the various aspects of brewing, this is perhaps one of the most astounding to me, just that microbiological component of yeast.
Yeah, yeast is such a funny thing because we take it so for granted today, but 100 years ago, 200 years ago, this was magic, right? It was essentially, this just happens, right? And then they found over time it took science and taxonomy, and we'll get into what is yeast and where it lands in the animal kingdom, right? All of the different things that exist on the planet Earth as a living species. Yeah. But it's cool because brewing is directly tied to the evolution of all that scientific equipment, microscopy and biochemistry and everything. And yeast is the model system to look at because it's a single cell and we can make a lot of them and then look and peel them apart and see what's going on inside of them and then understand it. And that's why it's kind of cool just to zoom out for this episode, really go a little bit bigger than we usually do with beer and go into yeast in general.
Yeah. I'm again, just to reiterate, I am by no means a microbiologist. This is not an area where I consider myself an expert, but I do enjoy digging into it and have a kind of a cursory understanding of what yeast is and how it works. Now, the basic is that yeast is a single-celled organism that is is a fungus essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the kingdom, that's the level. If you remember your biology class from from grade school, even there's a kingdom called fungus, and mushrooms are in there, and bacteria in there, and essentially these are single-celled organisms that take in nutrients, take in energy like food and then make something out of it, right? Run the cellular operations. There's things like ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and NADH, and all these things. These are little compounds that run around the cell and do different things and power up certain reactions, chemical reactions, redox reactions, electron chain reactions and stuff. So, while I will also say I'm not a microbiologist, I almost became a microbiologist. So I always find these things very fascinating. And so I dug a little deeper and tried to peel the layers off, but make it simple enough so we can all kind of get the language together.
So when we think about yeast, I think my brain just automatically goes to, and I don't know where this falls on that categorization thing, but my mind automatically goes to Saccharomyces, right? That is what we use for brewing, and it's also what we use for baking. And then so Saccharomyces, what is that? So you got fungus, which is the kingdom. Is Saccharomyces, does that fall somewhere beneath that, or?
Yeah, so you keep going down, right, to a specific thing, and so Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's genus, species. That's basically the last two levels, right? Saccharomyces being the bigger one, because Saccharomyces is made up of multiple things, and then Cerevisiae being one of them, what we call ale yeast, bread yeast, that kind of thing. So that warmer fermentation, that kind of, it's just categorized by that. But Saccharomyces themselves are almost all the same. We're going to talk about a few different strains today, but we're talking about something where, more than 99% of the genetic material is identical, right? It's just these small little differences that occur over time. In the most recent history, Kvike strains, right? All that yeast, all the genetics are identical, but they've been bred to ferment at 100 Fahrenheit, super high temperatures, right? Why did that happen? And that's all the little selective pressures that have been put on both yeast of Cerevisiae or Pasteuranis or all these different yeasts that we'll talk about.
Well, that's what I was going to say is you use the word, speaking of Kvike particularly, I think it's interesting because you use the word, they were bred to be that way.
Yeah.
I feel like they've almost evolved, they were selected by pressures you put on by the folks who were making these specific types of beer and in very specific environments and certain types of environments with temperatures and whatnot. And that to me, again, this is what I mean by astounding. It's like, man, we are witnessing very rapid evolution right in front of us over the last, 2 centuries, basically?
Yeah, exactly. So, we haven't, like I said, we haven't known what it was. We just knew to do it and keep doing it the same way. And then certain people made things better because they did it a certain way, right? Before they understood what was going on. And even you could argue today, we still don't understand what's going on at the time, but, we try to replicate, the whole point of this website is try to replicate these experiments and then to show you the data and see what happens. So, so in general, we have Cerevisiae, that's ale. And more recently, or at least we knew something called lager yeast, right? There's actually was up until a few years ago, a big debate as to the taxonomy of that. So there's Pasteurianus, or it was called Carlsbergensis or something like that previously. The Pasteurianus, and how that was come up was that was some type of hybridization of Saccharomyces and something called Eubianus, another Saccharomyces strain somewhere in Argentina. They got together and then created this other strain, and so that's what we call lager yeast. But they're still, again, very genetically similar. We consider lager yeast to be this colder fermentation, these more simple flavors, just in general, right? But then again, lager yeast make up 90% of all the beer made in the world, right? So it's still we still use it, right? I consider it the difference between science, which is like, I'm an electrical engineer and I use the science that was discovered to do engineering, right? We're brewers that are engineers. We don't need to know all the mechanics of how a cell works.
Right.
We just need to know how to use it consistently and effectively.
Exactly. How to make it do what we want it to do is how I speak about yeast often.
Exactly.
So just to, again, we're going to move on from here in just a sec, but you've got Cerevisiae, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which we refer to as ale yeast or top fermenting yeast. It tends to do well in warmer environments around that 68F 20C. You've got Pasteurianus, which is a hybrid. We've recently found out, I believe, right? It's a hybrid of Eubianus and Cerevisiae came together and they created this yeast that we refer to as bottom fermenting, or, it tends to favor cooler temperatures, though.
Correct.
We've shown over and over that it actually does fairly well at ale temperatures as well.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So for this episode, we are going to focus primarily on Saccharomyces cerevisiae because that is also the strain of yeast, or the type of yeast, I should say, that is used in baking as well. If you go and you pick up baker's yeast at the store, you will see that it is S. cerevisiae, just like your brewer's yeast. Mm-hmm. So before we get in too deep into the baker's yeast side of things, let's kind of generally talk about what fermentation is on a level that people like me might understand.
Yeah. So, we as multicellular organisms have a very complicated thing, right? We have organs that need fuel and power and stuff. So if we go to just a single cell and try to understand that, there's still a lot to learn. And that's why I said earlier, this yeast Cerevisiae is a model organism to figure out other reactions, because the chemical reactions, the pathways, the enzymes, they're in us too. They're just much, much more complicated, right?
Yeah.
So in a very basic level, you have a substrate. And we're going to talk about beer and bread today. So you have carbohydrates, glucose, maltose, maltreose and stuff. And then yeast can readily take those and with enzymes and other reactions within the cell create energy that the cell can use. Now, you might have said the word ATP or adenosine triphosphate earlier. That's like how a cell uses it. And it's a combinations of moving electrons around and splitting up carbon molecules. And that's what powers the cell, right? And so there's these pathways you can read about. You can go all crazy on the Crabtree cycle or the citric acid cycle and all these things online. And all these things are operating in a cell. But in general, yeast is going to take in those substrates. We care about maltose a lot because that's what is malted grain is, but also glucose is a big one, right?
Yeah.
These are all just rings of carbon with different amounts of hydrogen around them, and that's how they go. So that's what it is. So the simple chemical reactions just are all packaged in that single cell, and that's how that is a metabolism, right? That's not necessarily what we would call fermentation. There's our different words. They all mean slightly different things. But at a yeast, at a basic level, it takes in those things, and then it matters. The next question you have to ask yourself is oxygen present? So we consume oxygen to run cellular properties within our body, and yeast does the same thing. So if you start a fermentation, we all start a beer with some amount of oxygen in the beer before the yeast is added. We know this is part and parcel common practice for beer production. That's an aerobic fermentation. So the yeast will not only use the glucose or the maltose that's in the beer, but also use the oxygen that's present to do some type of chemical reaction. This aerobic fermentation is the most effective way to make energy. It really can make so much more ATP. It can fuel itself by using oxygen, right? It's just more ingredients, right? If you have more ingredients, you can do something with it. And so there's these chain reactions that go to something called pyruvate that then gets cleaved or something else and comes around and eventually makes ATP. One thing it does along the way, though, in both chains, is it makes CO2. So this is going to be key for bread making that we'll talk about later on, is that all of these chain reactions, these aerobic reactions or anaerobic reactions, make CO2 at some point. And all that is that as it's cleaving those glucose molecules, all these carbons combine with that oxygen, relatively speaking, and make that CO2. So that's aerobic. Now, if oxygen isn't present, that's beer making, right? If it isn't present, there's another chain. It's missing that oxygen, so it needs to rely on some enzymes. These enzymes essentially encourage a reaction to go a certain direction, right? These little yeast cells are little sacs of fluid. These things are all floating around, but these enzymes encourage paths to go a certain way, and they'll go from pyruvate to acetaldehyde and eventually to ethanol, which is what we want.
Yeah, I'm going to put it in. I'm going to dumb this way down. So, you put yeast in wort, and it eats the sugar, and it pees alcohol, and it farts CO2. That's kind of how my brain processes everything you just said.
Yeah.
But it's an amazingly technical process that goes on that yeast does that we have literally in the last 150 years or so figured out. It just blows my mind that we know this. So the way that my mind kind of thinks about this, so if you want to go a different direction, Andy, please feel free, is that I'm kind of got these two mental columns, and I've got beer in one, and since we're talking about baking, I've got baking in the other one. Yeast does basically the same thing in both, and I think a lot of people don't quite grasp that. Bakers out there are gonna think we are absolutely idiots here, or at least I am.
Yes.
But that's okay. We're trying to make this easy to understand, easy to swallow, and also I'm not a microbiologist. But you throw yeast into wort, it does that consumption, that metabolic process wherein we end up creating CO2 and alcohol through the yeast consumption of those sugars. Great. When you put yeast in bread or in dough, it's considered a leavening agent. In fact, I believe it is the most commonly used leavening agent these days. Probably has been for a long time, even before people knew that there was yeast in their dough. It does basically the same thing. You've got this starchy environment, and that yeast consumes the sugary stuff. It creates CO2. I'm not sure about the alcohol creation. I don't think it creates that much, right? But that CO2 is what puffs up that dough.
Yeah, exactly. The CO2 is made in both reactions. The alcohol is made typically when it's anaerobic, right? So I would say bread, there's a lot of oxygen around, right? You make a loaf of bread, oxygen just coming in. You want oxygen out of your beer when it's fermenting, right?
We've learned that, yes.
We want that, right? We want that always, right? But bread making, it's such a... we won't even get into the complex chemistry of bread making and hydration and everything like that. But at a basic level, it's swamped with oxygen. So it's going to always make CO2 and make that ATP and everything else. And the alcohol is really never going to come out. So
then that, you when we think about fermentation, the very first, you pitch your yeast and then you're in that, what we call the lag phase, right? It's that first phase of fermentation. During that, is the yeast producing CO2 and not alcohol, or because we know that it's replicating, and to replicate it has to metabolize, right? It has to metabolize some of that sugar.
So I was going back through their great resource. It's now a somewhat older book, but the Yeast book by Chris White. Yeah. He goes through this exact reaction, and that lag phase is the consumption of oxygen. It wants just to take oxygen as much as possible. Again, the most efficient way to make ATP, the most efficient way to make energy for a yeast cell is to have oxygen around. So it's just going to consume consume all that oxygen and then make more cells, make the energy. There's a whole thing about the cell wall and how tough it is as it needs oxygen to create those sterols. So it's just going to strip that beer completely of its oxygen before then it says, okay, I'm out. I need to go in an anaerobic phase. I need to go anaerobic fermentation, then start making ethanol.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me.
Fascinating.
Well, so here's what we know about yeast. I mentioned it earlier. If you've ever made a saison, and then you can take the same exact grist and pitch a different yeast, a non-saison yeast or a non-Belgian strain or a non-Weissbier yeast. You pitch Chico into the same exact wort, right? Split that 10-gallon batch into 2 5-gallon fermentation vessels, pitch different yeast. You are going to make a perceptibly different beer.
Absolutely.
There is no way it would be a dumb experiment. I mean, there's no such thing as a dumb experiment, but for a fact it would be that way because saison yeast just produces different byproducts. Now, fermentation is fermentation. It happens.
Yeah.
They're different yeast. The way I think about the different strains of yeast. So we are talking about the umbrella term Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and under that umbrella are all these various ale strains, right? That we know are cerevisiae. The way I think about it is this: I was born. I'm about 5'8.5". I'm giving myself a little bit of a boost there. I'm decently okay at shooting a basketball, but there's no way you're going to find me out on a basketball court. I am the same species. I am of the same, skin and bones as those 7-foot basketball players out there, but we're still different and we produce a different quote byproduct. And in this scenario, in this case, that byproduct happens to be basketball playing. As it comes to yeast, that's how I think about the way that they produce these different byproducts. And it's a wonderful thing because we have so many yeast to choose from, which means that we have so many different styles of beer that we can make. But those characteristics it's amazing how different they can be in terms of things like, say, attenuation, temperature tolerance, alcohol tolerance. I mean, you've got yeast out there that can handle, wine yeast. It's cerevisiae, and it can handle 14% ABV, whereas you might take an English ale strain that putters out at 9% ABV. Just amazing to me how different these are.
Yeah, and we've alluded to the the natural pressures are put on there, and you have to remember that. Okay, maybe 50 years ago when all those breweries started, like a saison brewery, they were pitching a certain way, they were reconstituting a certain way, they were saving their yeast a certain way versus an American brewery or an English brewery or a German brewery, right? So all that selective pressure just kind of winces on the yeast over time, and slowly but surely all those cells, because we pitch 100 to 200 billion cells, right? But we're making another 100, 200 billion cells, and then how many batches and how much repropagation, all that pressure over time, that consistent pressure, right? Not random pressure, but consistent pressure will drive the cell to a certain direction, and then that genetics sticks around.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So, Andy, I'm going to let you kind of take the reins on this because, again, I feel like a doofus if I try to talk about what we know that baker's yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. What I don't know, and I think about the two main ones. You've got Fleischmann's and Red Star, right?
Yeah.
We know that they're this ale yeast. We don't know, where it originated from. At least I don't. I couldn't find it when I Googled it. Is it a Belgian strain? Is it an American strain? Is it, or that's what we kind of classify them as now based on the characteristics they put off. But we don't know that. We just know that baker's yeast, if you add a certain amount, I make pizza all the time. That's my biggest experience with making dough and such. And I know that if I had 7 to 10 grams to about 900 gram dough ball, that it's going to puff up in just a few hours and allow me to make a really nice airy pizza dough, pizza crust.
Yeah, and I look too just to try to understand some history stuff. I don't think there's a good record because I think they just made it and that was it, and they don't think about that yeast as in the same way we consider beer yeast because of the amounts of styles, right? Bread has its style origins in the constitution of its ingredients, like how much wheat am I going to use? Am I going to use oil or not? Am I going to use milk or not? Am I going to use all these other things come from that? And the yeast is a little less the choice. Now, we're not talking about sourdough today.
Yeah,
but,
I was going to say.
A more wild, almost like spontaneous fermentation type of process is a little different. But, let's just focus on cerevisiae. I think of it more like it's the application, right? Clearly, baking yeast is meant to sit on a shelf for multiple years with an excellent expiration date and work every single time, right? You add so little of it to a lot of bread and it works very consistently. If you use it correctly, it's that way. So it's been bred to do this. I would call it, or I would, delineate, it was designed for aerobic fermentation. of bread. And beer yeast has been designed for anaerobic fermentation of wort. And those are the two real differences between them. Though they're more similar than not, those are really the reasons. They're mechanical reasons, in my opinion.
Yeah, and again, all we have on this, at least that I could find, is opinion. And we would love for anybody out there who's listening who knows about this subject better than us to give us some feedback, and we'll read it on a future episode. But that's what I could get out of it as well. They were like, well, hey, we know that this type of yeast does really well. It's shelf stable. I mean, obviously, we're speaking about the commercial stuff here.
Yes.
But if you really start digging into the baking thing, which I know a lot of people did, over COVID. I did not. My daughter did a little bit, but you'll see people. It's the same kind of thing that you see in brewing, which is, hey, listen, if you have like this fresh yeast, have you ever seen they have like this yeast cake stuff that they kind of crumble into their bread, into their dough, and like that's going to impart a different characteristic. Yeah, for the most part, you don't find much people focusing on the yeast that they're using for their baking. But if you go down those rabbit holes, you will absolutely see, outside of sourdough bread making, even, that people do believe that there are different characteristics you can get from your yeast. So one of the things that we hear often is like, hey, well, can you use brewer's yeast to make bread with? The quick answer is yes, you absolutely can.
Yeah,
I will say this though, you mentioned the shelf life thing. I made a batch of I was making pizza dough, and I'm in my head, I'm like, of course I've got, who doesn't have a million packets of Red Star sitting in their cupboard? Well, I didn't actually. I had a half of one that I'd opened like a year and a half ago, way in the back of the cupboard. So I thought, you know what, we'll just go low and slow on this.
Yeah.
And I pitched it. Absolutely, it took much longer for that dough to rise. I had to wait like 4 or 5 hours as opposed to the hour and a half I usually have to wait. So it's kind of the same idea. You can think about it similarly. But yeah, I think for the most part, we are not looking at baker's yeast as having any real impact on flavor development of the bread that you end up making with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another thing. And actually, as we speak on this, it's almost like bread yeast is more like Kveik in a way. It's dry, it sits around, at warm fermentation temperatures, it works, right? But we really care about its ability to create CO2.
Yeah.
And then talking about bread for a second, bread is this, carbohydrate rich, thing we eat. We have, created whole civilizations around creating bread, right?
Yeah.
So yeast is a very important part of this, or microorganisms that make CO2. I think that's a different way of saying it. And how that forms is that the combination of water, the wheat malt, or just the unmalted wheat in bread makings actually, and some salt and some other stuff. When you do kneading, when you knead the dough, you're creating gluten strands, and these strands form into those nice flaky things that you see in the beer in the final bread product, right? But if you don't knead it, you will not form those strands, and it's almost like a crystal, right? It almost makes these kind of network of fibrous things, and so you have to knead it, right? But that kneading process of making these gluten strands is what's going to eventually entrain CO2 into the bread, right? Once that yeast starts fermenting. And then when you get the leavening and then the proofing and the knockdown, and then you put it into your oven eventually and bake it, all that CO2, because it's getting really hot really fast, right? All that CO2 expands rapidly, but all that gluten retains it, and then you get that nice fluffy crumbly crust right in the bread. And sometimes it's a tight crumble or a hard crumb or something, but that's how that airiness comes from bread. And what's interesting is, like beer making, yeast is still going to give you flavor. You just have to understand where that flavor is coming from and what kind of flavor you want. And that's where bread making or long fermentations, I don't know if you've done a cold, you mentioned pizza making, right? Leaving your dough in the fridge cold for 3 days before you bake it allows that yeast to make more flavors, to really give the dough its own character rather than just CO2 production.
So yeah, I was going to mention that as well. And in fact, if you really get into the baking thing, you'll realize that they use the same term, fermentation.
Yes.
And particularly for aged or long-term, doughs that you're making for pizza or for bread. And in those cases, it is absolutely claimed, and I have done this, that if you cold ferment your dough, so you make your pizza dough, the way that I do it is I make one big dough ball. I let that rise initially. I knock it down. I ball it out right into the actual what I'm going to make my pies out of, my pizza pies out of, and then I'll let those re-rise either on the counter, or in the case of cold fermentation, I'll put them in the fridge. I've done the comparison, and I mean, naturally, that's kind of what we do. In fact, we joked about starting Pilosophy.
Yes.
Because we all love making pizza, I think. think. I've done the comparison, and I don't taste the difference from the cold fermentation. That could be an absolute, indicator of how crappy my palate is. But I don't. People swear by cold fermentation. I believe it's a big thing on Serious Eats. You got to cold ferment if you want to make the pizza with. Oh, and they'll also say it impacts texture as well, the bread texture.
Yes.
I the best texture I've gotten so far is when it comes from a blend of different flours, not necessarily the way I'm fermenting my dough, but I do, again, there's that crossover there. If somebody bakes, I feel like they have a decent grasp right off the bat of brewing and fermentation and brewing, and people who ferment beer, there's no wonder a lot of them are also into baking, right? Because there is a lot of crossover there.
Well, that's I was talking to someone else earlier about, how do you create recipes? How do you think about your beer brewing? I'm like, well, beer brewing is much more akin to bread making and baking than it is to cooking, right? Cooking can be a little bit for fun, and there's definitely kind of boundaries to keep on cooking, but baking is a very precise process. You need this much dough, this much sugar, this much yeast, this much time. And if you think about beer making, when I'm going to brew later today and I'm going to need about 6 hours to do everything, and then I'm going to let the beer sit for 2 weeks and I'm not going to think about it, right? Bread making, man, if you really want to be a good bread maker, it's your entire day, and you're always worried about it. Something is going to have to happen every hour or every 30 minutes even. You have to be on top of it. Otherwise, it's, I've lost more loaves and nothing was leavened because I didn't do something right. And I'm like, well, okay, I guess I'll start over. But it's a much more delicate process. So if you're a good bread maker, I think it's you can do brewing no problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, to simplify the idea here is that we know that baker's yeast and brewer's yeast are both Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's just that baker's yeast is one of the different strains out there, just like Saison yeast or just like Weissbier yeast. Well, we were curious what might happen to a beer fermented with your typical baker's yeast, and we put it to the test. Results from that experiment right after these messages. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When I first started brewing way back in 2003, I just graduated college with a bachelor's degree in psychology, of all things. In the 4 years prior, I had taken 2 biology courses, which left me with a very cursory understanding of what yeast is and how it works. But I was far from being a learned man on the subject, if you will. I knew that yeast was used in baking, but I just figured that the yeast was wholly different than what I was using to ferment the various ales that I was brewing. Obviously, I was wrong. A while back, the idea of fermenting a beer with baker's yeast came up among the Brewlosophy crew. We were just tossing the idea around. It's also something that gets asked probably on the daily on homebrewing forums. So contributor back then, Brian Hall, ended up designing an experiment to test it out.
Yeah, so baker's yeast versus brewer's yeast. Let's go. So single 10-gallon batch of Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, 77% Mecca Grade La Monta Pale Malt, 7% Venora Vienna Style Malt, 7% C15, 6% Victory Malt, and 3% C60. So just a classic pale ale recipe. Brewing process, Brian mashed in at 152 Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius. And, I think maybe throw this to Marshall. We'll talk about it for a bit. It'll be interesting because now we're using, I would say, a yeast that doesn't have any stats on it, right? We can't go to the Omega website and
Exactly.
find out the attenuation or the alcohol content. So, what do you think? This mash temperature, it's a middle of the road mash temperature, not too high, not too cold. But, I'm thinking, because each yeast wants a certain kind of general menu of sugars, right? This glucose, this maltose and stuff. And I'm wondering baking yeast might not really want maltose. It might not understand that, right? It might want some other simpler sugars, right?
That I think that's why Brian settled on 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 C was because, you read about alpha and beta amylase and we know how those work very well in the brewing world and how yeast tend to respond to that. We've got great stats on brewer's yeast and such. Well, we don't, like you said, we don't have that for baker's yeast necessarily. And so, they talk about that 152 to 154 Fahrenheit, which is 67 to 68 C, as being kind of the sweet spot for both beta and alpha amylase. And so I think that's why we went with that. We settled on that because we didn't want to favor the brewer's yeast in this experiment, in this run. And so that's why we did that. And, my assumption at this point is that the baker's yeast is probably decently attenuative, but who knows, right? We'd never done an experiment on it until this one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay. So 60-minute mash. Do the sparge out and collect all the pre-boil wort, and then he boiled for 60 minutes. So 16 grams of Magnum at 60, 14 grams of Pearl at 25, 14 grams of Fuggles at 10, and then 15 grams of Fuggles at 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll comment on this. This is not going to be a pale ale that I think the good majority of pale ale and IPA drinkers are gonna fawn over. This was an experiment that I did. We should talk about. I know we did a recipe design experience episode recently, but we should talk about like specific recipes every once in a while because I do think it's funny how we come to the recipes that we end up getting known for, right? That people brew over and over. Well, this is one of them. This was the first one. It was kind of an accidental thing. I first time using WLP 090 San Diego Super Yeast, and I didn't want to make a starter, so I threw together this weird recipe that would just stuff in my freezer, or in my garage. And I honestly, it was there just to build up a yeast cake, and we ended up really enjoying the uniqueness of this beer, which is kind of a American English pale ale hybrid. Again, unintentional. I realized it was tasty after the fact. So this isn't a blow your mind, hop in your face. It is a middle of the line, easy drinking beer, which we thought would be a good one for obviously trying out a new yeast because we didn't want anything, any crazy hopping to get in the way of the what byproducts that yeast might produce.
But still specifically an ale beer, right? That was the point, right? Ale
Absolutely.
Cervisier to Cervisier.
Yeah.
So once after he finished boiling, it was chilled and then split evenly between 2 carboys, measured OG 1054. Filled the fermenters, placed in Brian's garage, and Brian's garage sticks around 64 to 66 Fahrenheit or 18 to 19 degrees C all year round, so it's almost like refrigeration. And so for the variable, now we're introduced to the variable. He rehydrated 2 pouches each of Fleischmann's active dry yeast and Safale USO5 in 75 milliliters of tepid water for each. after 10 minutes of that, repropagation, that rehydration, the yeast was pitched.
Now, so in terms of the amount of yeast in each pouch, I'm sure Brian accounted for it, but I'm trying to remember. I do think they're both right around that 11 or 11 and a half grams mark, right? I think even the baker's yeast is about the same as what we get in a pouch. So.
Yeah, there are similar weights, and so 10 grams ish. This was, of course, there's a little bit of a variable in how well the rehydration process goes, ages of pack, stuff like that. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but at least in general, we're going to get close, I would say, by weight. As best as we can do is by weight. So
yeah. And I believe in baking what we call rehydration, which, nowadays the dry yeast labs are saying that may not necessarily be, needed. You don't need, it's not necessary to rehydrate. But in baking, there's a term for it as well, right?
Proofing or It's just checking the yeast out. I mean, it makes sense, right? If it's you just spent a bunch of time making this glutinous ball of dough, right? Spent days making it, and then you add yeast and it fails. Well, that'd be a problem, right? So you don't want that.
And you can tell even with brewer's yeast, you can tell that it's active if you get a little bit of foaming on the top after about 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So he did 10 days of fermentation, no more activity in the airlocks, no more activity in the carboys. So he took some hydrometer results, and I think this is incredibly interesting.
Yes, I was so excited for this part.
The finishing gravity on the baker's yeast was 1.009 versus the brewer's yeast, which was 1015.
Wow, dude.
Wow.
So I'll be honest. There's no reason I wouldn't be honest. My presumption, what I expected to see, was that the baker's yeast was less attenuative than the brewer's yeast. I thought that it was going to putter out. It's just not prepared, as brewers like to say, for the environment of wort, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you will see brewers say if you pitch a highly attenuative wine yeast into wort, it's not going to perform as well because it's just not, set up for that environment. So my assumption was that the baker's yeast would not be set up for the environment of wort, of metabolizing, maltose and maltotriose. But holy cow, it got it down to 1009 FG. That's pretty damn good.
I took all that and I thought about the same thing, that thought process of yeast is designed for a certain process. I think we're thinking about it a little backwards. Beer yeast is designed to create a specific kind of mouthfeel and finishing flavors and things like that. And the 1015 makes sense. Maybe it's a little higher than I would have expected for a mash temperature of 152 Fahrenheit. But then yeast, baker's yeast is just designed to crank on sugar and make CO2. So I flip my opinion. I'm actually, maybe I'm on the side of this was supposed to happen because it's designed to just eat sugar as fast as possible.
Sure.
Now, what I would actually like to see, it'd be harder to measure this, of course, was the finishing gravity the original gravity of the wort over time and how rapidly one fell over the other, right?
Yeah.
So I would think maybe the baker's yeast crashed the original gravity much faster than the brewer's yeast, but it'd be interesting to know that. So just to take it, an idea.
Yeah. So, that's our first data point, though. We've got an objectively measurable, the FGs are different by 6 specific gravity points, which that is, maybe you don't taste a difference if, regularly just based on, the whole long chain dextrins argument and whatnot. But wow, I mean, this is already saying that baker's yeast has the gusto to do the job.
Exactly. Yeah. So after measurement, the beers were pressure transferred to CO2 purge kegs and placed in a keezer where they are burst carbonated to let the condition for about a week before Brian began serving it to tasters. So we already have one objective measurement. The finishing gravity was very different. But looking at appearance, the beers looked identical to him. Color, clarity, foam, super bright. It's actually interesting to see clarity being that, because you would imagine maybe the flocculation of the two yeast strains would be different. But he waited maybe long enough for the flocculation to not matter. So I thought that was interesting.
I mean, Brian's got a great process. There's no doubt about that. He's a phenomenal brewer. These beers looked like he poured them out of a Bud Light can. I mean, they were very very crisp or very clear. Nice yellow color, absolutely beautiful. This was I was kind of favoring, our beloved brewer's yeast, and so I expected the baker's yeast to be hazy, or that beer to be hazier, and it was not. It was beautiful. So there's your second objective data point. They were while they were different in FG, they were identical in terms of appearance at this point.
Yeah. So in a series of semi-blind triangle tests, Brian got the beer every single time.
Every
he said,
time.
Every time. Yeah. So, 5 to 10 semi-blinds every time. So he said the beer fermented with Saf Ale 05 was a bit muddled. The one fermented with baker's yeast actually tasted like a poorly executed Belgian ale.
So descriptive.
Excellent. Wow. Excellent. So he did end up entering this baker's yeast in a competition as a Trappist single and got a low 30 score, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That's not a bad score.
That's not a bad. That means it's in style.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to me, I was so glad that Brian did that, because you start, I think that there's everybody wonders, what is baker's yeast going to do to this beer? Is it, or where was it sourced? What's its original, area that it came from? Is it a Belgian? Would it be more akin to a Belgian strain or an English strain, or a German ale strain or something?
Yeah.
Well, it scored in the low 30s for a Trappist single, and you have to remember, I don't think Brian is a fan of your basic modern hop pale ale. So I think his comment on the beer being muddled was likely more a recipe thing, not a yeast thing. I think it was just that it's a boring recipe to him, which it kind of is, that people like me really love. So
simple beer.
It's a simple beer. And so I wonder, though, if he had gone with your kind of a classic Trappist single grist and hop schedule, but fermented it with that Belgian yeast, might it have scored even better? I mean, maybe the low 30s had nothing to do with the fermentation character, and it had to do with other aspects of the recipe, right?
Yeah. And I think I was going to bring this up later about, what could be going on with the flavor, but I think we could talk about it now is, baker's yeast is not going to have nearly the same type of quality control that brewer's yeast has, right? We don't know what's in that packet of Fleischmann's. It's mostly going to be yeast, but I'm guessing there's going to be bacteria, there's going to be other stuff, maybe some phenol positive wild yeast in there, right? So I'm not that surprised that this character came out, but I'm also not convinced it's the baker's yeast doing all the heavy lifting in that flavor. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. So we know Brian's performance, his own personal performance. This did occur before COVID, so he was able to serve it to 20 participants, out of which 11 would have had to identify the unique sample in order for us to say that, a significant finding. And in the end, how many participants actually guessed the odd beer out?
Crossed over the threshold, 12. So it was significant. People could tell these apart.
People could tell them apart. I just think, so now you've got Brian, who, as the biased brewer in this experiment, consistent, 100% consistency, able to tell them apart in his blind, semi-blind triangle test. But 12 out of 20 participants, 60% of the participants were able to tell these beers apart, which is fairly reliable. I mean, that's pretty good. And then when we do an experiment and we serve it to actual participants, which thankfully we're getting back to doing that more often nowadays. If it is a significant finding, because the readers have asked us to ask this question, I personally hate it, but we asked them which one they preferred the most. The reason I hate this question is because of how subjective preference is. So don't take this as anything other than interesting. Out of the 12 people who were correct on the triangle test, 7 said they preferred the brewer's yeast beer, so the one fermented with US-05. 4 liked the beer fermented with baker's yeast more. That is not a huge difference, if you ask me. And then one person had no preference despite noticing the difference between the beers. So you've got, it's not an even split. I get that. But 4 out of 12 people, who were right on the triangle test thought the baker's yeast beer was better than the brewer's yeast beer. Figure that one out.
Well, what I think is important to remember, and like you said, it's kind of just this extra anecdotal data, is that because it's subjective, right? It's your personal preferences weigh in so hard. And, it's so funny as you read this, when we do find significant data, it's always pretty even. It's 60-40, 40-60, pick it one way. I don't think we've ever had a case where it's like no one would drink the other beer, right? There's always someone in that group that's going to like that other beer or enjoy it more than the other one, right? So, yeah, I mean, this makes sense. This all drives together. We've already kind of gone it through on this episode, is that these yeasts are a lot more similar than they're different. In this case, they were you could tell them reliably apart. But that doesn't mean we made a bad beer either way, right?
No, to me, it's basically like we figured something out. You can make beer with baker's yeast, which is, I don't think that's news to anybody. But that the beer that you make is probably more similar to a Belgian style than it is an American style. So we put that in our tool belt and we say, if the zombies are coming and we get really thirsty, we can grab a pouch of, Red Star or Fleischmann's and make a decent tasting beer that's drinkable. I think that's awesome. So no surprise, implication-wise, Saccharomyces cerevisiae can be used to ferment beer, even if it's of the baker's sort. I do wonder, though, just based on Brian's assessment and then the fact that these beers were different, if baker's yeast isn't POF positive or phenolic off flavor. I don't know why they call it off flavor, but because sometimes you want that, but phenolic off flavor positive, meaning that it produces those phenols that cleaner cerevisiae strains just don't.
Yeah, and it's very possible, right? Again, it's not designed for anaerobic fermentation. It was never meant to do that. Yeah. So it's meant to do the gas production and some flavor production, objectively, subjectively, to be determined how much flavor comes from the yeast. I'm sure a bunch of bread flavor comes from yeast, but who knows how they're packed? Like I said, I think that these things do not have nearly the same quality control that a beer manufacturing yeast company would make. So
yeah,
but it's an interesting experiment, and it's cool to see that it still made something we would call beer, right? And it got, and like I said earlier about that BJCP score, if it's above a 30, that means it's in style, which means it's not only a beer, it's a beer that represents Trappist single to some degree.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, wild to me. I think it's so cool. And I'd really be interested to see this experiment done again, but rather than comparing it to a notably clean strain like the Chico strain that was used in this one, using something known to throw off more character like, B45 Gnome. That's what came to mind first. If Imperial Yeast B45 Gnome has this, subtle phenolic thing going on. It's obvious Belgian character, but it's not in your face. To me, it sounds very similar to what, how Brian described this Fleischmann's beer. So, but also comparing it to something like Rustic or, Stefan, that Weissbier yeast, just to see how much more similar those are. And because if you can figure out, hey, you can use bread yeast to make these more yeast characterful styles, I think that's pretty rad. So, well, we've got some reader comments. First one comes from Zach Bauer, who says, I'd like to see this tried the other way, baking bread with USO5. I'd say more than half of the comments on this article, by the way, were basically the same thing as Zach's. So I picked his because it was the first one on there. But yeah, I've actually done this sort of. I ran out of baker's yeast one time when I was making a batch of pizza dough. So I went out to my garage and I opened I have a freezer that's just for hops and dry yeast. And I use Belle Saison often for my hard cider. And so I had a pouch of Belle Saison. I opened it up. I added about half of it just to supplement the yeast that I did have. I think I had like 3 grams left over of Red Star and I needed like 12 in this dough that I was making, 12 grams. So I just went and supplemented the rest of it with this Belle Saison. It took a little bit longer for the dough to rise. At least, I thought it took longer, but in the end, I didn't notice it worked just fine. The dough did rise. I was able to do all of my same pizza dough making process, and I noticed no difference in the flavor of that bread. It's not like I got Saison character out of the dough,
Yeah, and I figured that would happen. And the reason I say that is that it's still, the mechanisms involved are identical, right? The bread yeast and brewing yeast still have to go through an aerobic phase, an anaerobic phase, and then they go dormant.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised I am not surprised you didn't get flavor, because you're going to bake that thing at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. You're going to blow off, we think, oh man, these flavors are so complicated and so strong. I mean, the flavors made by yeast are so delicate and so temperature sensitive that as soon as you heat them up or do anything to them, they're gone, right? So all you got is that CO2 and maybe a little bit of that flavor that was entrained in the dough, and that's it. So yeah. I'm totally not surprised it didn't taste like a Saison when you bit into it. So
that would be so weird, wouldn't it?
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, it would be so rad. All right, next comment comes from Rudy, who says, when I was in Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm, I got my hands on some bread yeast and pure grape juice from a local canteen. It wasn't the best wine, but it did the trick in a pinch in a dry country. Thank you for your service, Rudy. This is something I've actually heard from quite a few people, is making what we call pruno in the prison industry with bread yeast or and some sort of grape juice. Pruno, in fact, the most common way to ferment pruno is you'll get one of the inmates will work in the kitchen and they'll just take a little dough ball from the bread, because they make their own bread, and that they knock that dough ball, toss that into their weird blend of fruit juices, and it ultimately ends up replicating and fermenting their pruno. So
yeah. I mean, probably not the most, the best beverage, not going to get any awards for that beverage, but, it's going to make alcohol, which is, well, that's what you're trying to do. So
that's the point, right? Especially with pruno.
Yeah.
JJ Hull says, I did the exact same comparison with Red Star active dry yeast versus Safel USO5 in March of 2016, mainly because I bought a 2-pound brick from Costco for $4.50, and the packets of Safel USO5 from the homebrew shop cost $4 alone. So I figured, what the hell, couldn't be that bad. I split a 5.5 gallon 3-gallon batch of a light pale ale into 2 different fermenters. The Red Star showed faster, more aggressive fermentation and attenuated to a lower FG than US-05, so similar to what we saw in Brian's experiment. He said it was 10.06 for the Red Star and 10.10 for the US-05. I had 5 friends come over and try both beers. General consensus was that the Red Star left an aftertaste on the back of your tongue. 2 guys liked it. The others preferred the US-05 yeast. If I was stuck and didn't have any yeast available, I would use it again. I also think I could cover up the aftertaste with more hops. Good points.
That's cool. It's interesting to see, as more data comes out. I think, we're going to see more of this, like you mentioned earlier. People will post this on any homebrew forum, like, can I use bread yeast? And just to see how people interpret it, because it sounds to me like we're very close, right? There's probably a yeast strain, like we said earlier, that a brewer's yeast strain that matches the flavor you get from bread yeast. So it's super interesting.
Yeah. Final comment comes from Ian Monahan, who says, old timer told me back in the Prohibition days they would mix a can of LME with water and float a slice of bread with a teaspoon of yeast on it to make beer. Tasted bad, but he said it had a kick.
Well, that's one way to make beer, I guess. I don't think I'll be doing that one anytime soon, but okay.
I think it might be Drew Beecham who's said that human beings have this knack for constantly figuring out ways to make themselves feel different. And
yes.
if it's out there, we will find it. And I guess floating
yes.
bread with yeast on it in whatever you want to call that concoction will do the trick and has a kick. So, well, thanks for all those comments. And Andy, I think that's about all we've got on fermenting beer with baker's yeast. Any final thoughts?
I mean, this is a super cool experiment, I think, to zoom out and really kind of think differently. Don't just have the same 4 ingredients, though yeast is still yeast. It is cool to think about. Personally, I don't think I'm ever going to be doing this unless it's unless we come up with a good experiment. Honestly, this makes me want to do Fleischmann's versus Red Star at this point. That's all
we have to do it, man. That's exactly what I've been thinking.
Okay. So we will. I'm willing to fire that one off to fall on the sword and make that beer. So we'll be talking about it soon.
Yeah, sounds good, man. Well, don't forget to check out the Brew Lab, a podcast where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.